Okay, so this is a mini lecture about deduction, which I know can be super confusing. So I hope this will clarify things a little bit for you. I'm going to give you some examples of deduction, and we'll talk about what you do when you identify deductive reasoning. So first of all, what are these two different terms, deduction and induction? So deduction is logical reasoning. It's where you take established principles and show how those principles lead you to a conclusion. Okay, so you're using the kind of gears in your brain to figure things out, and that is different. One thing that's important is that deductive arguments, if they're sound, that means that they're true. They're absolutely true. They can be proven absolutely. Now, of course, that's kind of complicated finding a totally sound deductive argument, but in theory, a deductive argument can be 100% solidly true. Inductive reasoning is a little different. It's looking at the world, looking at empirical evidence that's out there in the world, and then making generalizations about it. So that's inductive reasoning. I like to think of it as deductive reasoning is taking principles up here and then looking at something in the world and applying the principle to that thing that you're looking at. Whereas inductive reasoning is the opposite. You look at the thing in front of you and you say, what can I make of this? And then you try to derive a kind of principle or understanding from it. So deductive reasoning is kind of like going down, and inductive reasoning is kind of going up. Evidence is part of inductive reasoning. You're looking at patterns in evidence to make a prediction or a generalization. So this is from the book. The subway ran yesterday at 6 a.m. and the day before at 6 a.m. and the day before that. So I infer, that's deduction, I infer that it will also run today at 6 a.m. That's probably a pretty good guess. But do you know that for sure? No, you don't. Inductive arguments can be credible. In other words, yeah, that sounds believable. I believe that. But it can never be shown to be absolutely true. We don't absolutely know if the subway is going to arrive at 6 a.m. Okay, so we're going to focus in now on deductive reasoning today. Inductive reasoning will be for tomorrow. Deductive arguments are called sound arguments when they meet two criteria. They are true and they are valid. So, and it's an argument can be true but not valid, or it can be valid and not true. And if either one of those things is off, it's not sound. To be sound, it's got to be both of those things. Okay, are the premises true? That's about the content of the reasoning. And for truth, what that means is that the premises, which is what you build an argument on, have to be reflected in reality. They have to be true statements. Okay? And when we're looking for it being valid, we're looking at the form. The premises have to kind of lead logically from one step to the next. And if they don't, it's not valid. It's invalid. It's illogical. It doesn't work. I'm not going to be sound. All right. Some other important vocabulary. Syllogism is where you'll see it's a way of notating, a way of writing down deductive reasoning. That looks a little bit like a mathematical formula, and we'll be seeing some in this presentation in a moment. An enthymeme, this word is not super important that you know, but it's important you understand the concept. A syllogism that has not been spelled out completely, but it's basically a syllogism written into sentences. But often there is missing information that you need to fill in. And you'll see that in the lesson about writing about deductive reasoning. Okay, 2 vocabulary words there. All right, so let's look at some examples of deductive reasoning. So first of all, we're going to go back to January 2017. So this, and you might remember these photos if you were looking at the news that day. This is the inauguration of President Trump. And on that day, there were a lot of news sources that published these 2 photos right next to each other. The photo on the left is the inauguration of Barack Obama, and you can see that the National Mall is filled with people. The photo on the right is from the inauguration of President Trump, and you can see that the National Mall is not full. And so this was being published by several news sources on that day. And then there was a press conference. So this was the press secretary at the time, and he came on and said this.
Secondly, photographs of the inaugural proceedings were intentionally framed in a way, in one particular tweet, to minimize the enormous support that had gathered on the National Mall. This was the first time in our nation's history that floor coverings have been used to protect the grass in the mall. That had the effect of highlighting any areas where people were not standing, while in years past, the grass eliminated this visual. This was also the first time that fencing and magnetometers went as far back on the wall, preventing hundreds of thousands of people from being able to access the mall as quickly as they had in inaugurations past. Inaccurate numbers involving crowd size were also tweeted. No one had numbers because the National Park Service, which controls the National Mall, does not put any out. By the way, this applies to any attempts to try to count the number of protesters today in the same fashion. We do know a few things, so let's go through the facts. We know that from the platform where the president was sworn in to 4th Street holds about 250,000 people. From 4th Street to the media tent is about another 220,000. And from the media tent to the Washington Monument, another 250,000 people. All of this space was full when the president took the oath of office. We know that 420,000 people used the DC Metro public transit yesterday, which actually compares to 317,000 that used it for President Obama's last inaugural. This was the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration, period, both in person and around the globe. Even the New York Times printed a photograph showing that a misrepresentation of the crowd in the original tweet in their paper, which showed the full extent of the support, depth, and crowd and intensity that existed. These attempts to lessen the enthusiasm of the inauguration are shameful and wrong. The president was also at the Central, as you know, the president was at the Central Intelligence Agency today and greeted by a raucous overflow crowd of some 400 plus CIA employees. There were over 1,000 requests to attend, prompting the president to note that he'll have to come back to greet the rest. The employees were ecstatic that he's the new commander-in-chief, and he delivered them a powerful and important message.
All right. Okay, so you can see there that Sean Spicer is trying to argue with this representation we see here using logic. He's trying to make a kind of logical point. He brings up several facts, several things to kind of counter this representation with logic. So let's look at what he says. So here's one example. He says, this was the first time in our history that floor coverings were used to protect the grass on the mall. That had the effect of highlighting any areas where people were not standing, while in years past the grass eliminated this visual. And then he goes on to conclude, this was the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration, period. So he's talking about these white coverings here and saying that highlighted the empty space. Okay, so that therefore it was the largest audience to witness inauguration. All right, so we're gonna turn that into a syllogism. So a syllogism is like this mathematical formula. So we have a minor premise. The floor coverings were used to protect the grass on the mall. The major premise is that the white color of the floor coverings highlight areas where people are not standing. So the difference between the minor and the major premise is a more general principle. The minor premise is a less general principle. That is not so important, but you want to just understand that these are two premises that a conclusion is being based on. And the conclusion is this was the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration. So what do you think about this? Is this a sound form of reasoning. It is not sound because the premises are true. It's true that the floor coverings do highlight the areas where people are not standing, but the conclusion doesn't follow. It doesn't. We can't say just because we can see the ground better that means there were more people. That is illogical. So it's not valid. Okay, let's look at another. Let's try to correct it. Floor coverings were used to protect the grass in the mall. The white color of the floor coverings highlight areas where people are not standing. The conclusion could be, well, what do you think? I think the conclusion might be that the it's more visible where people were not standing. We can definitely conclude that. That's not as strong of a statement, and you can see why you didn't want to say that because that's not that interesting or important. Okay. All right, here's another example. We know that from the platform where the president was sworn in to 4th Street, it holds 250,000 people. From 4th Street to the media tent is about another 220,000. And from the media tent to the Washington Monument, another 250,000. All of this space was full when the president took the oath of office. So let's break that down. So we have the broader principle, the major premise at the top, the more particular principle, the minor premise, which is that all the space was full when the president took the oath of office. And then he didn't state the conclusion, but you can, if you do the math, you can see his conclusion is that 720,000 people were there. What do you think? Is this sound? So no, it's also not sound. The logic here is valid this time, but the minor premise that all the space was full is just not true. We know that because we look at the picture. We can see that that's not true. All right. Okay. So, so one thing to think about, we have invalid syllogisms and untrue syllogisms. So this was an example of a untrue syllogism, and this is an example of an invalid syllogism where the logic doesn't follow. So one thing to notice is that invalid syllogisms are pretty easy to spot, because if he says this was the largest audience, you go, I don't know. That doesn't make sense what you're saying. It's easy to spot that. It can be a little bit harder to spot the untrue syllogism, because we have to know that minor premise is false. We have to look at the picture to figure that out, and that can be pretty tricky. So this is something you want to do when you're looking at someone's deductive reasoning. You want to really look at their premises. Is that true, what they're saying? And that's one way, an important thing to do when evaluating deductive reasoning. All right, let's look at another example. So this is now from the book, okay? So all terrorists seek publicity for their violent acts. John Doe seeks publicity for his violent acts. John Doe is a terrorist. Do you think that's true? Is that, is that sound? And while you think about that, I'm going to draw a little picture. Okay. All right. So I've drawn a little picture here, and sometimes this can be a helpful thing to do. I hope you can see this. So let me bring it down. There it is. Okay. So you can see I've drawn a circle of people who seek publicity for their violent acts, is that larger circle. And within that, we have terrorists. So terrorists we've defined as people who seek publicity for their violent acts. But are there other people who seek publicity for violent acts? Yes, of course. So John Doe could be in the terrorist circle, or he could be outside of the terrorist circle and still be a person who seeks publicity for his violent acts. So what is it that's not sound about that syllogism? it is that it is invalid. Okay? Um, oops, sorry. It's invalid. The logic doesn't work out in that case. Those things, we're going to assume both of those things are true, but we don't have the information, of course. But let's assume they're true, but it's not valid. All right. So then there's sort of different kinds of syllogisms. We have an if-then syllogism. If the mall is full, then there are 720,000 people on it. Um, that's the if statement. It's hypothetical. The minor premise: the mall was full at the inauguration. Therefore, there were that many people at the inauguration. So of course we know we've already established that minor premise is false. But that if-then syllogism, we could correct it and say if the mall is full, then there are 720,000 people on it. The minor premise, we can correct it and say the mall was not full at the inauguration, and the conclusion, therefore, there were not 720,000 people at the inauguration. Or we can do an either or. This is called a disjunctive syllogism. Either you are dead or you are alive. That is true, probably. And the minor premise, you are sitting and breathing in the classroom or in wherever you're looking at this right now. Therefore, you are alive. So there you go. So that's a sort of either or. It's another kind of logic that people use. Now, sometimes that logic can be problematic. Either you're with us or you're against us. You're not with us, therefore you're against us. So that, of course, but what's wrong with that? Of course, in most situations, there's a lot of gray zone between with us or against us. And so that kind of reasoning can be reductive, is what that's called, where you're reducing possibilities. And there's a fallacy built into that, which we'll look at next week. A dilemma is an interesting kind of issue that deductive reasoning can be involved with as well. So this is another example from the book which I've added to a little bit. So the dilemma is, number one, if the U.S. supports the Syrian government, it would also be supporting a dictatorship that has been linked to terrorism and crimes against humanity, and furthermore is an enemy of some of our closest Middle Eastern allies. That sounds not great. Major premise number two: if the U.S. supports rebel groups within Syria, it may be subject to attack by the al-Assad regime, extending the Syrian civil war and inviting potentially dangerous conflict with Russia. It is also possible that weapons could end up in the hands of ISIS. Okay, that also doesn't sound good. Major premise number three: the U.S. continues to do nothing, innocent people will continue to die. None of that sounds good. And the minor premise is that either the U.S. supports Assad or the rebels or does nothing. Those are kind of the three choices. So what should the U.S. do? That's a dilemma. A dilemma is when you have to choose between, different unattractive options, and those are the options you have available to you. And of course, in life, we encounter this all the time, but it can help to kind of spell it out this way in the syllogism form. The only way to resolve something like this is by making a value judgment. What do you want to prioritize? Do you want to prioritize ties with the Middle Eastern allies? Do you want to prioritize the rebel groups? What kind of value? What's the most important value that you want to do? Okay, another example. We're coming to the end here. To show fault in another's reasoning, you can use logic to unpack someone's reasoning. So, also from the book here. So, you believe that there should be no legal restrictions of any kind on the sale and ownership of guns. Okay, so that's the premise that you've gotten from the other person. That's their belief, their kind of abstract belief. So, you're going to put in a minor premise to now show what the consequences of that belief are. If there are no legal restrictions of any kind on the sale and ownership of guns, then guns could be sold at corner stores and vending machines, regardless of whether the buyers have sight problems, mental health issues, or criminal records. So that's what you said. That's what that if that's what you think. And so the conclusion is that the person really believes that guns should be sold in all that way. So this is called reductio ad absurdum. That's Latin, of course, to show that you think maybe they haven't thought through their position well enough, and you want to show them the consequences of their position. Okay, this is example 8, I guess. Consistency. I'm a vegetarian. Yesterday I had a burger at In-N-Out. So there's an inconsistency there, right? So that's, again, you can kind of break apart principles. Well, here's another, of course, very debatable topic, where someone might say the death penalty is murder, but abortion is not murder. Or we could flip that around. The death penalty is not murder, but abortion is murder. So one could look at consistency there. I'm not advocating for either side here, but one of the reasons this is so complicated, both of these issues are so complicated, is that we look at consistency. When is killing something allowed? And it's highly debatable and highly charged. And again, values really come into play here to help you resolve these kinds of issues. Another example: I support all humans' rights to express themselves freely, but I do not support the use of the N-word. Okay, so again, that's the principle that I say I support, but when it gets to the actual case, I don't support that. So there's a consistency problem there too. So maybe either I have to change the principle, or I have to change what I think about the N-word. All right, let's do a quick quiz here. Sound or unsound? The minimum requirement for teaching English at a community college is a master's degree in English. James, me, teaches English at a community college. Therefore, James has a master's degree in English. What do you think? Sound or unsound? Sound. It's good. Okay, though both of those premises are true, the logic is good, so it's sound. All right. When students are absent, it's because their car broke down or they are sick. 5 students are absent. Therefore, 5 students are either sick or their car broke down. What do you think? Sound or unsound? Okay, unsound, obviously, right? So why is it unsound? Is it unsound because it's invalid logic, or because the premises are false? Well, let's assume the minor premise, 5 students are absent, is true. The first premise, when students are absent, is because their car broke down or they are sick. That's false, right? That's there could be lots of reasons, and it might not be one of those. So so it's an untrue premise, a false premise. All right, that's it. So I hope that helps understand deductive reasoning a little bit. And now you have a chance to apply deductive reasoning to this reading we've done on Colin Kaepernick. I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with. Alrighty.